Hey YouTube, today I'm going to show you how to make a front-facing vise or clamp for the Harbor Freight workbench. This workbench is a very popular workbench, but one of the drawbacks is the vices, a tail vise, are on the side of the bench, which makes access difficult. And what I'm going to show you is a quick jig that I made that allows you to use an F-clamp as a front-facing vise for this workbench. I entertained a lot of different ideas, but this one turned out to be the best that worked for me. I got the idea of just using an F-clamp to put onto the front lip of the bench. You can see here underneath the bench, the table, there is sort of an overhang that allows you to put clamps here. But the clamp would fall down once you undid it or loosened it. And so I wanted something permanent. It's not easy because the space was kind of tight. In addition, the front of the bench is not perfectly flat, you can see here, and that didn't turn out to be a problem. So the first thing I did was I decided to make a prototype. So I just used some scrap plywood and started figuring out different designs that I could use. And so what I wanted to do was use something that would hold my clamp in the front of the bench and stay on the bench without sort of falling off and stay connected to the bench, but would also be removable later on. And I tried a couple different designs, but this is the one that seemed to work the best. And I think the key here was finding something that would fit into that small space underneath the bench, given that the vise was there and not get in the way of the vise. So the first thing I did was cut out a small groove on this flat rectangular piece of plywood, and this rectangle will actually be a space to allow where one of the cross beams are underneath the surface of the workbench. You can see me here test fitting it. I recommend test fitting it frequently. The next thing I did was try to carve in a little bit of a slot for the clamp to go into. And rather than carve a hole, I just discovered a sort of vertical slot with then a perpendicular slot. And that would allow me to slide the clamp in from the side. For the final version, what I would do is I would actually put a hole into the jig without the side sort of slot, and then I would have to actually modify the clamp itself so it could be inserted in there without that sort of side slot. I suppose you could do that. And here you can see me testing it out. It fits in there. It will hold the clamp up. This is actually just with a pressure fitting. It holds there pretty tightly with just that little slot. And this is what the final prototype looks. Not very pretty, but it works and it'll allow me to do it. And here I'm holding the prototype with just a quick clamp to test it out to make sure it works, and it seems to work very well. And holds the piece in there. Some of the cuts I made on there were a little bit big, and you can see that it's not perfect. But what I was able to do was then use my sort of test prototype to make a final version using slightly nicer plywood. I sort of refined the size of the cuts I needed to make, and I would make it a little bit smaller so it wouldn't be as noticeable. So the first thing you do is you put these grooves in. The grooves allow you to put it right underneath that bench on the right side next to the vise, and this groove accommodates one of the cross beams. The next thing you need to do is to modify the F-clamp. They sell these at Harbor Freight for $2 to $3 to allow you to stick the F-clamp through that jig. I used my $6.99 sort of rotary tool from Harbor Freight to sort of knock off that bump on that F-clamp. Went through about 4 or 5 of these little cutting discs. Took a while, but eventually the bump came off, and that allowed me to sort of put the F clamp through there. Here I'm sort of testing the hole size, actually pounded the clamp into the hole to make sure it was the right size. It took about 15 to 20 minutes to remove the nub, and this nub removal will allow you to slide the bottom piece of the clamp all the way off so you can put the jig in between the two parts of the clamp to squeeze them together. Here I'm just sort of making the hole a little bit bigger and pressure fitting it into the clamp. And so there's the hole for the F clamp and the groove for the F slot, and then I'm now marking off a little bit of an X on the right, and I'll show you how that is going to be used as a holder to hold off or hold up the jig underneath the bench. So here's the piece that's cut out, and I'm going to put that small piece and screw it to the other side of the bench. I could have used glue, and maybe in hindsight I should have, but I thought I wasn't sure if this is the way I wanted to hold this jig in under here. So what I did is drilled a small hole here, and I'm going to insert this small piece that is a cutout underneath the bench right where it would have normally fit, and this will serve to hold up the jig. The space was tight, but I was able to sort of sneak in a small screw. I would highly recommend pre-drilling, but be careful because it's very thin. You might want to drill all the way through. And then as I was drilling, I heard some cracking, and I noticed that because I was so close to the bottom edge of that tabletop, there was some cracking. And so I didn't screw the screw in too tightly. I didn't go all the way. I did notice once I tried to put the jig in there, it didn't really fit. So what I would recommend is you take that little cutout piece, put it back in the jig, put the entire jig back in under the bench, and then screw it in for the appropriate location. And here you can see that little cutout piece screwed in underneath the bench. This is with the jig into it, and so you can see how it'll hold the jig up, and it actually fits nicely. This is the jig with the F clamp through it, out underneath, and now as a demonstration you can take your little jig. The F clamp slides off because I've sort of grinded off that knob there. Careful putting the clamp together. Sometimes there's a little spring in there, a wire spring to keep the clamp sort of tense there, the quick release, and so you don't want that to pop out. And now I can sort of slide it in there and keep it in there. And it actually stays in there fairly tightly. And you can use it as a front-facing vise. I thought about putting a second one in there, or further to the left so I could have two clamps. One seemed to work all right. The other problem is that the drawers prohibit you from putting another clamp in there. I may sort of make a further modification to the wood clamp, actually put a block that's at the same level of the workbench. So you can imagine it sort of being glued or directly epoxied or fastened to the F clamp and serving as a true vise. But this seems to work really well. And you can store it by taking it apart and putting it in one of the drawers, or I just keep mine put together in one of the tool wells and take it out when I need to use it. All right, YouTube. If you have any questions about this modification or build, please feel free to leave me a comment and I'll address them. In addition, subscribe if you're interested in future modifications to this workbench. I think the next thing I'm going to be working on is either a tabletop vise or improved bench dogs for the Harbor Freight workbench. All right, thanks for watching. Talk to you later and have a good one. Bye.